The 1970s were a pretty swanky time, and if you had a house, maybe the interior looked like this. But in general, the 70s were a decade of excess, at least the early part of the 1970s. The latter part of the 1970s and the Jimmy Carter era, well, that was fundamentally different than how the 70s started. But a number of vehicles in the 1970s were great, handsome lookers, and particularly before the 5-mile-an-hour impact standards came into play in 1973 in the front and 1974 in the rear, a lot of cars were actually quite good looking, and they were enormous. By this point, cars had grown so large, this would be the largest of the passenger vehicles, obviously not counting today's SUV craze. But a lot of the cars also looked quite good. And what we're going to do today is focus on what I think are the top 10 best-looking cars of the 1970s. And we're going to focus here on the full-size cars and intermediate vehicles, not the sports cars. There are plenty of vehicles that could make that list, but here again, we're going to focus on just the full-size cars from the big four, let's call them, automakers: GM, Ford, Chrysler, and AMC. So let's get started with number 10. And at number 10, we have the 1971 and 1972 Ford LTD. Now, the Ford LTD was all new for the 1971 model year, and it departed pretty significantly from the styling of the 1970 model year. It had hidden headlamps, and it did have kind of a protruding nose on the 1970 version, but that nose got even more pronounced for 1971 and into 1972, as the general manager of Ford at the time, Bunky Knudsen, would come over from GM, where he had, among other jobs, run Pontiac Motor Division, decided he wanted to put his stamp on Ford styling and asked designers to make the Fords look more like Pontiacs. So the 71 Ford LTD really got this nose that was somewhat akin to the 69 Grand Prix, for example, from Pontiac. And that nose would also be featured on cars like this 1970 and 71 Thunderbird in the Ford lineup. But the 71 LTD really doesn't matter if it's a coupe body style or the four-door hardtop or the four-door pillared hardtop, as it was called. They all look great. I think they all look very masculine and have very masculine styling associated with them. And on the interiors, they also had very comfortable seating. So just great cars, well-built, sturdy, good engines under hood, whether that's the 351, the 400, or the 429 for 1971 and 72. They're all good engines, good transmissions, and just great cars in addition to their good looks. So that's why that makes this list at number 10. Let's move on to number 9. And at number 9, we're going to stay in the Ford stable of automobiles and put the 1970 to 72 Continental on the list. Now, you notice that I've been specifying so far with the Ford, the 71 and 72, not the 73 LTD, and with the Continental, the 1970 to 72. That's because in 1973, as I mentioned before, the big bumpers came on to the vehicles, and that just kind of ruined some of the styling. But the 70 Continental was, again, all new. This was a return to body-on-frame architecture. The previous generation Continental from 1961 to 1969 was a unibody car that was built on a platform similar to that of the Ford Thunderbird. But for 1970, the Continental, again, returned to its roots as a body-on-frame vehicle. And it did so with this awesome coffin nose-esque hood on it. Now, Lincoln would use this theme for a number of years and across a number of vehicles. Ford did have kind of the Rolls-Royce style grille that they introduced on the 1969 Mark III that continued on through 1971. But this was a different theme, kind of in that Cord 810-ish style. But this car, kind of similar to the 1971 to 72 LTD, looks pretty menacing. It just has a menacing presence associated with it, especially if it's in a dark color and if it doesn't have a vinyl top on it. Take a look, for instance, at my 1972 Continental Coupe that's all black, no vinyl roof, no body side molding, no door edge guards. And the car just looks like it's a mafia car. It looks sinister. And that just owes to that relatively low roof line, these, I'll call them pontoon-like fenders with the fill the cube styling, the fenders extending all the way out to the corners of the car, similar to the 1961 Continental when it was originally introduced. But I have to say, I love the 70 to 72 Continental styling, whether it's a two-door or the four-door sedan. There was no four-door hardtop on these. I think the four-door sedan is also a rather handsome vehicle. And on the inside, you got a pretty awesome interior with this racetrack theme, big hooded instrument panel, rolling drum speedometer, full gauges. I really enjoy the interior theme on these vehicles. I wish the interior materials were a little bit better quality. They were better quality than the Cadillac, for sure, of the era. But they weren't just quite up to what the previous generation Continentals were or what the Mark III was. That said, again, these vehicles are extremely smooth, smoother even than the LTDs and the Mercuries. They just ooze down the road with their 460 cubic inch V8s that were premium fueled in 1970 and 71 before going to regular fuel in 1972. So they went down a little bit in horsepower for 1972. But you know what? They're no slouch. These are big, heavy vehicles, and the engines just do their job with absolute silence. And that's what you feel when you're driving one of these is basically nothing. You go over bumps, you don't hear any impact harshness, you don't feel anything. And that's the way cars should be. And that's why the Continental makes the list. And of course, in addition to its beautiful styling for the 1970 to 72 model year. Let's move on to number 8. And at number 8, we have the two model year 1976 to 1977 Pontiac Grand Prix. Now, the Pontiac Grand Prix was redesigned for the 1973 model year. The 1973 through 1975 model years aren't bad-looking vehicles, but those single headlight cars, I don't think, quite have the panache and overall style of the 1976 to 1977 versions. And what you see here is a 1976 version with this beautifully fine-textured, vertically oriented grille. And again, you just have this Pontiac arrowhead-style nose. You have a bit of that similar theme out back where there's this distinct taper to the rear, and I'll call it the shoulders on the deck lid. Just taper in nicely, almost a pseudo boat tail theme. But these vehicles were also very popular and great sellers, not only because of the looks, but because they were comfortable and reliable vehicles. This was the waning years of the Pontiac V8, and 1976 would be the final year for the Pontiac 455 cubic inch V8. You could get smaller V8s under hood in that particular model year as well. As 1977 would roll around, the Pontiac 455 was discontinued. You could still get a 400 cubic inch Pontiac V8. A lot of those for 1977 were even equipped with Pontiac's 301 cubic inch V8, which wasn't a bad engine, but it just didn't have the oomph that the 455 had. Now, on the inside, these also had some beautiful interior themes, and I have to say that I most like the ones with the bucket seats and the console. They did offer bench seats, but the bench seat just doesn't have the same kind of flair on the inside as the center console did. If you happen to get a Grand Am for the 1973 model year, you basically got the Grand Prix dashboard, but you also got real wood trim. Unfortunately, on the 76 to 77 Grand Prix, the wood trim was fake, but the kind of wraparound dashboard was very handsome. I think the seats are handsome. The interior was overall comfortable. Although I will say with the center console, it was a bit cozy despite the overall size of the vehicle. But I think the 76 to 77 Grand Prix was just one of those great-looking General Motors cars from the big bumper era, something that was relatively rare. Let's move on to number 7. At number 7, we are back to the Fomoco stable and the 1971 to 72 Mercury Marquee Coupe. Now, if you have been watching this channel for some time, you'll know that I'm a fan of Mercuries from about 1967 to 1974. Those are my favorite in terms of style. And I think the 71 and 72 are the best. Although I will say the 1969 and 70, this is a 1970s list, so we'll forget about the 69. But the 70 Marquee is also a handsome car. And they all the Marquee that I mentioned have hidden headlamps. But I love the 71 and 72 in particular. Probably the 71 the best because it has this very linear style grille that spills over into the headlamps, whereas the 72 has an egg crate theme up front, which I like, but I don't like it as well as the 1971 theme. And the 1971, you got the premium fuel big block engine under hood. Great thing about your Mercuries as opposed to the Fords, you've got bigger standard engines in them. So in 1971, you got a 429 cubic inch two-barrel. Yes, I said that right. Two-barrel or two Venturi V8. Optional four-barrel or four Venturi 429. 1972, you get a standard 429 cubic inch four-barrel V8. It was detuned because it was a low compression engine. But partway through the 1972 model year, they would make the 460 optional. Previous to that, the 460 was a Lincoln exclusive. Now, the 71 and 72 Marquee Coupe in particular, I just have to say, looks like a sketch. You have this extremely long hood with the Lincoln-esque coffin nose, similar to what I was describing on the 70 to 72 Continental. But then you have this extremely long deck lid and quarter panel. It looks almost cartoonishly long, like you could land a helicopter on the back there. But I think it looks just great. I love how the belt line has this kick up on the rear quarter glass. And that just sets up the rear so nicely and gives it this pinched roof line. These cars have a relatively low roof, and when you're inside, you'll notice that they do feel a little bit claustrophobic, but they just drive down the road supremely well. The Mercury's had a little bit shorter wheelbase than the Lincoln's, 124 versus 127 inches on the Lincoln, but they were bigger than the Ford's at 121 inches. And Ford, interestingly, put all different types of sound insulation packages in their vehicles depending upon what level trim you got. So a Marquee Brougham, as an example, had more sound deadening in it than a Marquee, and the LTD Brohms had more than the LTDs. They really went to great lengths to make these cars silent and smooth, and it just shows. The quality is so great too. Ford was actually building relatively good quality cars with good gaps and fits and finish. Can't really say the same about General Motors during that time or even Chrysler. But the 71 to 72 Marquee, and we could throw in the 70 for an honorable mention too, is just one of my favorite looking cars in the 1970s. I think the four-door hardtops and pillared sedans look good as well, but the coupe is definitely my favorite. Let's move on to number 6. And at number 6, we have the 1972 Imperial. Now, the Imperial was offered in coupe or four-door hardtop form for 1972. It had pretty much all new styling for that model year, although this was still the fuselage era for Chrysler. The Imperial, in terms of a fuselage-style Imperial, was introduced for the 1969 model year, but as I mentioned, it's a pretty heavy refresh for 1972. And I just think that, again, the car looks menacing and futuristic, and I love the front that kind of almost looks like a rear end. For whatever reason, I just think that it looks cool, especially the supersized parking lamps that kind of harken back to earlier, I think they're called wood light lamps. And then out back, you have these vertical style tail lamps, a little bit a la Cadillac, but done in a very different way. And again, I just love the super clean body sides of these fuselage era cars. The Imperial, to me, especially the 72 Coupe, is just a masterpiece. Now, on the inside for the Imperial, the other thing that I love is the interiors with the significant amounts of button tufting. And Chryslers of this era weren't necessarily known for their interiors. In fact, I would say they were pretty cheap on the inside. But when you got the Imperial, you got a more thickly padded dash. You got the awesome button-tufted leather interior similar to the Barcelona-style chairs. You got super padded door panels with pockets in them, lavalier straps in the back, head pillows in the back, reading lamps in the back. Just was a rather lush interior, great place to be. And, of course, you got Chrysler's 440 cubic inch mill under hood that, again, was detuned by this point, but was still making around 225 horsepower and tons of torque. Now, one of the great things about your Imperial was that it also was a hidden headlamp car, and somehow Chrysler actually got the hidden headlight doors to line up pretty well often with the rest of the grille. So it does look like the headlamps are actually invisible, and I think the way that Chrysler executed that was pretty gosh darn superb. Note that I didn't include the 73 Imperial on this because it basically has the same styling. There's a little bit different detailing, like the grille texture is different on the 73 Imperial. And I frankly don't like it as much as a 72 grille texture. But you also got these supersized bumper guards to try to meet the impact standard, and they look rather silly. Now, you can take them off, but let's just go with the 1972 Imperial. And I have to say, whether it's the coupe or the four-door, they both look great. I do think the coupe just looks menacing, ultra long, really because it is. In fact, the 73 Imperial was the longest passenger car produced, non-limousine passenger car, and they're unibody, by the way. And interestingly, while the exterior did share a fair amount of Chrysler body panels, including the roof, excluding the plug in the back to make the backlight smaller, the Imperial did have its own unique front suspension and isolated front suspension cradle, too, to really give a quieter ride. And you definitely notice it. I owned a 72 New Yorker as well as a 72 Imperial. And once you have the Imperial, unfortunately, the New Yorker just can't compare. It's still a great car, but the Imperial is even better. Let's move on to the next one. And at number 5, we have the 1971 to 72 Eldorado. Now, the 1967 to 1970 Eldorado was a hard act to follow. The 67 Eldorado in particular is just the supreme definition of a gorgeous car. Again, very masculine in its styling overall, razor edge type styling, kind of what Bill Mitchell, the then General Motors vice president of styling, would call the crease in the pants type look. In other words, there was a lot of tension set up because of all the creases on the car, and it just, I think, looks fantastic. One of the best looking cars, I would say, ever produced. So that was a tough act to follow, and it was made even tougher by the fact that General Motors program planners decided that because the 67 to 70 Eldorado and its e-car siblings, the 66 to 70 Riviera, the 66 to 70 Tornado, weren't overly successful from a sales standpoint, that these new e-cars were going to come off of the full-size General Motors platform. And as a result, they would have to share A-pillars and front windshields and front glass and quite a few other pieces of hardware. So that really set the stylists into a box of constraints because they had to employ a platform that was much larger than what they really wanted. It was hard to get a car that was really sporty with those tremendously large dimensions. But I have to say, I think the 71 to 72 Eldorado does achieve success in that regard, particularly when you get a 71 to 72 Eldorado in a dark color like this beautiful Empire Maroon 71 Eldorado. It just looks fantastic. The hood is enormous, although it is a single-piece hood versus a two-piece hood on the 1967 to 70 Eldorado. Imagine the blank size for this particular hood. Just immense. And I love the kind of four-fendered theme that's set up. Clearly there's the front fenders, but also you have the rear fenders that's set up by that trim piece that you see. And I also love the rear. It looks and is ultra wide with this bevel theme that runs throughout the entire car, both on the deck lid as you see and on the front of the vehicle. Just a superb looking car. Now, unfortunately, one of the last minute decisions that was made on the 71 Eldorado before it came out was to give it an opera window to try to set up the 73 Monte Carlo when it was going to be introduced. And I think that was unfortunate. If this car had hardtop styling and a rear quarter glass as opposed to just that fixed opera window, I think it would have looked even better. But, well, that was a decision that was made. And it was made at the very last minute, as I mentioned, for better or worse. On the inside, unfortunately, though, 71 and 72 Eldorado, the material quality just really isn't up to par, I would say, for Cadillac. The instrument panel isn't made of anything rich, isn't very distinctive. In fact, it looks rather cheap. I would say the door panels look rather cheap. Kind of sad for what was a very expensive car for the time and something that on the outside looked especially like money. But oh well, I guess you can't have everything, and that is one of the Achilles heels of the 1971 to 72 Eldorado. But you do get the great 500 cubic inch V8 underhood that was admittedly detuned for the 1971 model year, and that would continue through 1972, but still was plenty powerful to push around these big land yachts. Let's move on to number 4. And at number 4, we're going to rotate back to the Mopar stable for the 1972 Dodge Monaco. Now, the 72 Dodge Monaco received a significant styling refresh. Again, this was still the waning years of the fuselage era styling for Chrysler. 73 would be the final year. Didn't include 73 here on the list because of, again, just like the Imperial, those supersized bumper guards. And I love the 72 Monaco for a number of reasons. Not only the clean styling overall, but the hidden headlamps that just give the front a very unique and interesting look. And then I love out back the full-width taillight, kind of a la Ford Thunderbird almost, that accentuates the width of the vehicle. Now, the Monaco, as I mentioned, would be changed a little bit for 1973. Those bumper guards would really make the front not look as good, and the rear would be changed. That full-width taillight would be gone for the 1973 model year. And that was unfortunate because I think it really gave it some excellent character. I also love that skeg line on the side that kind of sweeps up at the end that is formed by the wheel arch, the front wheel arch, and just kind of carries back. I think it gives the side profile some nice dimension. Unfortunately, the Monacos of this era didn't have all that great interior materials or overall fit and finish. They're not bad, but they're not all that great, I would say. But the 72 Monaco, I think, is just a looker. I would love to have one, whether a 4-door hardtop or a 2-door coupe. But there's another fuselage era car on this list that I'd even like to have a little bit more. We'll get there in a minute. Let's go now to number 3. And at number 3, we have the 1972 Lincoln Mark IV. Now, 1972 was the first year of the Mark IV, and it came on the heels of the 1969 to 1971 Mark III that was a huge success when Lee Iacocca effectively told designers to put a Rolls-Royce grille on a Thunderbird. And that's basically what designers did. It was very, very successful. So they repeated a similar kind of design philosophy for 1972. And I think the result was even better from an exterior styling perspective than the 69 to 70 Mark III, in part because the Mark IV departs from a number of very typical Ford styling traits. The fender profile, as an example, is not absolutely flat like it is on the Mark III. If you look at the Mark III from the side, the fender almost looks like it's rising. It's an optical illusion because the fender is perfectly flat, so your eye perceives it to have a slight rise to it. But the Mark IV has this nice lead-in to the front fender profile, has this tremendous bow out, I guess, in the middle with a beautiful feature line that runs down the side, unfortunately disguised here by the body side molding on this particular vehicle. But it also has these very sculpted wheel arches that give it some dimension and an extreme tuck-in underneath that I think, it's just a sexy looking car. I also love the tapered style rear as opposed to kind of a flat-esque rear. It doesn't make the trunk very large. In fact, I would say, given the full-size spare, the trunks on these Mark IVs are pitifully small. But the car overall looks great, and especially in darker colors, it looks like a gangster car, maybe in part because it was in some cases. Now, unfortunately, the interior of the Mark IV is really a bit of a letdown. The materials and some of the fit and finish just was not in the same league as the Mark III. Wasn't bad, but if you had a Mark III and then you bought a Mark IV, I'd be kind of upset. And the overall daylight opening, the glass area in the car is very small. It's a very squinty kind of greenhouse, almost modern-day sports car-esque. There's not much distance from the top of the instrument panel, top pad, to the roof in the car, maybe a foot at best. And the instrument panel is massive, very tall, makes you almost have kind of a claustrophobic feeling on the inside. So I would say before you buy one of these Mark IVs, just make sure that you like it. They do drive very smoothly, maybe even more smooth than the Mark III, and that might not be a great thing. I would say the Mark IV is kind of waterbedy in its ride, and that can sound nice. I did actually drive my Mark IV one time in the Appalachians, as not up to high heights or anything, but definitely down some circuitous roads. And I was feeling a bit nauseous after a while. I thought, I had to drive from Raleigh, North Carolina to Roanoke, Virginia. Boy, it's a great day. Why don't I take one of my classic cars? And whatever reason, I decided to pick that Lincoln. And it ran fine, didn't have any issues, but going back and forth and up and down was not a great car to select. They should have picked something with a firmer suspension, because the Mark IVs are softly sprung. I can't say that enough. But they do look great, and that's why they made this list at number 3. Let's continue on to number 2. And at number 2, we're back to the Mopars, and my favorite fuselage era car, one of my favorite Mopars of all time, the 1972 Plymouth Grand Fury Coupe. And I love this car. I love the hidden headlamps. I love the big loop bumper on it. I love the proportions, the kind of bulging out rear quarters that get fatter at the bottom, and they have this beautiful surfacing to them. Now, unfortunately, just like the other Mopars that I mentioned, on the interior, the Grand Fury isn't necessarily the most beautiful. The fit and finish, the material quality isn't great. On some of the cars, it's not horrible, but this is where the Chrysler cars of the era were really a bit of a letdown, was on the overall interior quality. But hey, you can't have everything, I suppose. Oh well. And now we're going to finish off with one of the best-selling cars of the 1970s, the 1976 to 1977 Oldsmobile Cutlass Coupe. Now, in 1976, the Cutlass got a pretty hefty styling update. The original kind of colonnade-style Cutlass was introduced for the 1973 model year. After, I would say, the 72 Cutlass is a beautiful car. And, maybe that should be an honorable mention or even higher up on this list. But the car that really put a Cutlass in many driveways in the United States was the 1976 to 1977 Cutlass, with this beautiful waterfall-style grille that draped over the front end of it. Now, interestingly, according to some friends who were stylists in Oldsmobile Studio at the time, including Dennis Burke, who's a fun friend, and he always loves talking to finance people, this was actually a mistake. What was happening was that on a clay model, the Oldsmobile engineers had a vertically oriented grille, and when they try to kind of make up the clay model with the front end graphics, they'll use some kinds of paper that they'll stick onto the model to at least give it that look of reality, because you can't really make the grille out of the clay itself. And apparently, one of the chief stylists for GM walked in the Oldsmobile studio as they had the paper just kind of sitting there on the clay model, and it was draped over the front. And he loved it so much that that became the styling on the 76 and 1977 Cutlass. Unfortunately, the Cutlass would be redesigned for the 78 model year, downsized a little bit. It just wouldn't look quite the same. I'm not a fan of the 78 Cutlass, but the 76 and 7 are just beautiful, beautiful cars, front, side, rear. And the interiors, you could get some pretty awesome interiors in the Brougham Cutlasses of this era. They actually had very comfortable, loose cushion style seats. I wouldn't say that the dashboards were anything to write home about, but overall, these cars just drive supremely well. The Oldsmobile V8s are smooth as liquid velvet, and so are the turbo-hydromatic transmissions. The suspension on these just really hits the right mark. It's not too soft, not too firm, gives good handling, certainly by the era standards, and a good ride too, and a nice quiet ride. So it's no surprise that the Cutlass became so tremendously popular. Great looks, great mechanicals, great drivability. What more is there to like? And that's why it makes number 1 on this list. So did I miss any vehicles? Put a comment in the comment section. What do you think are some of the best looking cars of the 1970s? Hope you enjoyed this series. Thanks again for watching.